For decades, the official story was clean. Reports were rewritten, numbers were reduced, timelines were blurred. What happened that day was quietly labeled unfortunate, unavoidable, or a tragic consequence of the times. But behind sealed documents and the forgotten testimonies, the truth looked very different. It was a story not of accident, but of choice. In the months after the disaster, families began asking questions. Why were the warnings ignored? Why were evacuation orders delayed? Why did help arrive only after it was already too late? Survivors spoke of seeing government officials on site before the worst moments happened, watching, waiting, taking notice. One man testified years later that he overheard an official say something chilling: "If we move now, it becomes our responsibility." So they waited. By the time action was taken, thousands were already beyond saving. Hospitals were overwhelmed, but records show that emergency resources existed nearby, completely unused. Military units were within hours of deployment but were never called. Communication lines were deliberately slowed. Information was filtered before reaching the public. Newspapers the next morning printed sanitized headlines. No more photos, no more names, no more sense of the real scale, just silence. Inside government offices, a different conversation was happening. Internal memos discussed public reaction management. Advisors warned that revealing the full truth could cause unrest, lawsuits, and the political collapse. So a decision was made, not to save lives, but to control the narrative. Compensation was delayed for years. Investigations were buried under bureaucracy. Whistleblowers were discredited or reassigned to dead-end jobs. One official, years later, confessed anonymously, "We didn't lie about what happened. We just never told the whole story." Generations grew up never learning what really occurred. Textbooks skipped over it in a single paragraph or ignored it completely. But history has a way of resurfacing. Decades later, classified files were quietly declassified. They were heavily redacted, but not enough. Researchers began connecting the dots. Journalists found glaring inconsistencies. Families finally saw proof that their loved ones were abandoned, not just lost to fate. The disaster wasn't just natural. It wasn't just an accident. It was a choice. A choice to delay. A choice to remain silent. A choice that cost thousands of lives. And even today, many of those responsible were never held accountable. Not in court, not in history books, only in the memories of those who were, sir. And in the silence that followed. They called it an accident. That single word became the final shield between the truth and the public. When the official investigations concluded, the language was careful, almost surgical. No more blame, no more names, no more consequences. Reports were released months later, buried under technical jargon and vague conclusions. Equipment failure, miscommunication, unforeseen circumstances. But buried deep inside those documents, in footnotes most people never read, was a different story. Warnings had existed for years. Internal memos showed engineers had raised alarms. Safety inspectors had filed reports describing the exact failure that would eventually happen. Local officials had pleaded for funding to fix the problem. Those requests were denied, not because the danger was unknown, but because fixing it was expensive. And admitting the risk would have caused public panic. Instead, they chose silence. Families of the victims began asking questions. They demanded hearings. Lawsuits were filed. Journalists tried to dig deeper. And that's when the walls went up. Documents were suddenly classified. Witnesses were advised not to speak publicly. Some officials quietly resigned and disappeared from public life. The media, chasing the next big story, moved on. A new crisis replaced the old one. A new headline buried the dead. Years later, a former official finally spoke off the record. He admitted what men had suspected all along. "We knew people would die," he said. "We just didn't think it would be that man. And we didn't think anyone would remember." But memory has a way of surviving silence. In small towns, survivors still gather every year on the same date. They light candles. They read names that never appeared in official speeches. Because history didn't forget. It was taught to forget. Today, when we look back, we are told this tragedy was unavoidable, that no more one could have predicted it. But the truth is far more disturbing. This wasn't a failure of technology. It wasn't a twist of fate. It was a choice to ignore warnings, a choice to delay action, a choice to protect systems over lives. And when the day finally came, the nation didn't scream. It didn't stop. It stayed silent. Thousands paid the price for that silence. And the people responsible were never held accountable. Not in court. Not in history books. Not in the collective memory. That is why the story still matters. Because the most dangerous disasters are not the ones caused by nature, but the ones caused by decisions made behind closed doors. And the silence is often the deadliest weapon of all. Thanks for watching. If you found this story important, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the history we were never taught. See you next time.